Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be getting my garden ready for winter. I've been really lucky this year. I've got a tropical garden here in North Scotland with tropical style plants, and normally there would be frost damage in September, maybe October, but today it's actually the 25th of November and it's still not been a hard frost here. So we've had probably about 2 degrees, 0 degrees, something like that. So we've had a very light frost, but it's not been hard enough to kill any of the plants. There's maybe been a tiny bit of cold damage. You can see on some of these plants here, there's a little bit of damage on some of the leaves on the castor oil plant here, but generally there's been no cold damage at all. I'm very fortunate this year. But basically in the next day or two we're going to have some quite severe weather. We're going to have 80-mile-an-hour winds which are going to destroy pretty much anything that's still standing. So even though I was going to hopefully keep some of these plants unprotected to see how much cold they could handle before they got damaged, just as an experiment, I'm actually going to cut them all back because the wind's going to absolutely destroy the leaves. And these leaves have already been shredded by 60-mile-an-hour winds, so if we get 80 or 90-mile-an-hour gusts then it's definitely going to be shredded. Same with the tree dahlia up there. That tree dahlia I don't think will survive over 60-mile-an-hour winds. And then once the winds die down, we're probably going to have -3 and snow, and that will kill anything that isn't frost hardy. So what I'm going to do in this video is I might keep the castor oil plants. I'm not sure, just see how much cold they can handle and wind they can handle out of interest. But certainly by my banana trees, I'm going to cut all the leaves off these. Now most of these are Musa sikkimensis, so they're not particularly hardy at the stem level, but they are hardy at the roots if they're well mulched. So I'm going to be making some protective covers for them. I'm going to be covering the stem, see if I can stop the stem from dying back, but I'm also going to be putting loads of mulch around the base. So I'll definitely know that they'll come back from the roots next year, and if it's not too cold this winter, they should hopefully come back and at the height they are now, because hopefully with the insulation I'm going to put in, it might protect them enough to keep some stem. And the other banana I'm protecting is this one here, which is Musa basjoo. That stem is quite hardy, so down to -5 I should maybe be able to keep that stem. So that one I'm quite hopeful to keep, but I will insulate that as well, as we had -15 last year, so I need to make sure that it's also well insulated. And as for the tree dahlia, I'm actually going to try and keep some of the stem on this just to see if it will regrow from higher up and I can get some extra height next year. So there's the stem here. This is a bit like a tree trunk now, it's quite thick, even though this has only grown up this year. So this stem here at the back, I'm going to cut it down probably to about 2 foot in height. I don't want to go any higher than that because it is leaning. I'd like to keep it slightly straighter, so I'm just going to cut it off to where it starts leaning, insulate the bottom section and just get rid of the top, because there's no way I'm going to be able to overwinter this. Too big for me to keep this frost free, and the winds will easily snap this off. So I'm going to go ahead now and start tidying up the garden, getting it ready for the insulation. So here in the front garden I've got 2 other banana plants that need to be looked after over winter. So these are the 2 Ensete ventricosums either side of the door here. Now these are a little bit different to the Musa basjoo and the Musa sikkimensis. These aren't hardy at the root level. They can take temperatures close to freezing, but below freezing will kill them. So I need to keep them indoors and away from the frost. Now because these plants are so big, I don't have a conservatory large enough or with enough grow lights or heat for them to grow over winter. So I'm going to be dry storing them. So what I need to do basically is need to take off all the leaves and take off most of the roots as well, until I'm left with just the trunk down here. And then the trunk, what I'm going to be doing is storing this in a cool, dry place, keep it dormant over winter, not give it any water or any light, just keep it in a dormant state, and then come spring I'll pot it up into a plant pot, start watering it again, it will grow new roots, start growing leaves again, and then by the time it's warm enough outside, it'll be ready to go back outside again. So that's the process I'm going to be doing with these 2 Ensete bananas. So I've now dug up both of the Ensete ventricosum bananas. What I'm doing now is I'm just leaving them on upside down so I can drip all the excess water out. Unfortunately this one here is underneath basically a pigeon roost. We've had pigeons roosting up there. So there's lots of pigeon droppings that have got into the cracks in the leaves and the water's just gone really putrid and it really stinks. So I'm trying to get as much of that out as possible. Once that's dripped out, I'm going to remove most of the soil, clean it up a little bit, try and maybe rinse it down because there's a lot of pigeon droppings on it, and then I'm going to store it inside somewhere cool and hopefully that will dry store okay. But it's interesting to see the roots. There are some really quite thick roots, especially at the base here. A bit difficult to cut through them. I will give these a clean cut, because if I leave a large open wound like that, there's more likelihood that that could get infected and rot could set in. So I'll be cleaning up these with sharp secateurs, cleaning off most of the soil, and then just dry storing this over the winter. So we're now partway through insulating the plants, and I'd like to show you the technique I'm going to try this year. I've not really seen anything like this online, but I thought it might work, so I thought I'd give it a go. Basically, I had to do a lot of insulation work in my loft recently. I had a lot of old bits of insulation. Basically, my loft was originally insulated with this insulation, but the spacing between the rafters was actually about this wide, so there was a big section of uninsulated loft. So I had to remove all the old insulation and put new insulation in at the right width. So I've got all this old insulation that's come out of my loft, which is probably a bit rough and not going to be used for anything else, so I thought I used it to insulate my banana plants. So what I've done is I've scraped away all the mulch from the bottom. I've cut the bananas down so they're just below the height of the top of the insulation. I've then held all the insulation together with long bamboo skewers, you can see them here. Then I've sealed up the edges with expanding foam because they were quite roughly cut, so some of them were really quite big gaps, you can see there and here, so I had to put expanding foam to seal it up, but also to glue it together as well. Then what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to put a bit of mulch down the bottom just to give the very base of the roots a bit of extra insulation. Then I'm going to put a top on here, which will just be another slab of PIR insulation like this. That'll just form the roof. I'll hold that down with a brick to make sure it's solid. Now the insulation on the top, I might let some air gaps in there because you don't want this completely airtight, otherwise you get a lot of condensation building up. The plant will sweat and it could lead to rot problems. So I'll put something on top. If there's very big air gaps, I will stuff it with probably some horticultural fleece or something just to stop the worst of the wind. But generally I want a little bit of airflow so it doesn't get too wet in there and too humid. And then I'm going to bury around the base quite high with mulch, probably about 20 centimeters or so, just to make sure the roots are really well insulated and that the roots will be fine, even because some of the roots might be further out than the base of the insulation here, so I'd like to insulate a little bit further out from the actual plants. So I've only got enough insulation to do 3 like this. So I've done 3 sikkimensis because they're the least hardy varieties. So the basjoo is over here. I've actually completely surrounded it with layer upon layer of woody material. So I had loads of Jerusalem artichokes. I also had some castor oil plant offcuts, and also the tree Dahlia. A lot of these have got hollow stems with kind of foam inside, so that's actually got quite a lot of insulation properties. Also the way it's mounded, there's lots of air gaps, and I've then covered it in a mulch to hold it down, stop the wind blowing it away, but also to fill in some of the gaps so there's not too much airflow through there. And that should hopefully insulate the Musa basjoo enough that the stem will survive. If not, at least the roots will survive because that's very well mulched at the moment. And then for the tree Dahlia, again, I didn't have enough material, so all I've done is put extra thick mulch around the base and then wrapped up the whole thing with fleece, and then put a bit more mulch around again just to keep the fleece down, and a stone to keep it down as well. So that might not work, but that certainly should be enough to insulate the roots, because before I wrapped it up I gave it almost a foot of insulation around the base of the stem. So I know the roots and the tubers will definitely survive on this, just not maybe the stem. And then when it comes to the other plants, there's not too much more I need to do. I'm going to let the oxalis fend for itself, maybe a little bit of extra mulch, but not too much. The canna lilies, they've not done very well this year. I think it's too cold here in Scotland, so I'm just going to let the frost kill them. If they come back next year, it's fine, I'll let them regrow, but I'm not too bothered about keeping them. I think the climate here is too cold. The castor oil plants, they'll die from the frost. There's no point me protecting them, so I'll just let them go until the frost destroys them. And then further back, I've got some Hedychiums here. The Hedychiums, they should be fine at the root level, but I will give them an extra mulch around the base just to protect them a bit further. The top growth, I'm just going to leave and let the frost kill it off, but the bottom, I'm just going to mulch maybe 20 centimeters of extra mulch, make sure the roots don't freeze in the tubers, and they should be fine like that. And then the only other real plant is my Zantedeschia here, or giant calla lily. This one, I'll wait until the leaves get destroyed by the frost. Once the leaves are destroyed by frost, I'll then give it an extra mulch around the base, but it's already got thick mulch around there. Got a lot of leaf cover anyway, protecting the roots, so that should be fine, but I will give that an extra mulch just to make sure that's protected. And this is a bit of a marsh plant, so it doesn't mind the wet, so I don't mind it getting soaked by the rain. But I'll just give it an extra mulch of material just to give it a bit of insulation. So the smaller Musa sikkimensis, I'm actually going to put a giant box over it. I'll show you what that is now. What I've got here, I think it's an ammunition box, I'm not sure. There's a lot of RAF bases in the area, but basically there's this insulated box, which, as I say, I presume it's an old ammunitions box, but I'm going to put that upside down over the sikkimensis, the small one. That should insulate it from the worst of the frost. This is some of the mulch I'm using, which is old wood chips, and the rest of the mulch I'll be using is all this bark here that I've used previously in the front garden. It's just waiting to be used elsewhere, so I'll just use that to add extra mulch to the bed and insulate the roots from the coldest of the winter frosts. So that's the plants all wrapped up and ready for winter now. So there's one or two slight things I might have to change in the future. So for example, there's a few gaps still that might seal up, but as I say, I like to have some gaps so I can get airflow so it doesn't get too humid and rot away. I've also weighed these down, probably about 20 kilograms of concrete and bricks to stop the wind from moving them. I've also mulched them around the base to stop any of the cold creeping into the root sections, because it's the ground that really needs to be kept frost free to stop the roots from freezing. So it'll be interesting to see how well it works. Now if it does get really cold, I will seal these gaps further. You can see there again, if it gets really cold, like maybe -10, I'll try and seal them up more thoroughly, and then maybe remove the packaging to allow a bit more airflow in milder weather. But generally this is how I'm going to leave it for most of the winter now. This should hopefully be enough. It really depends on how our winter is. As I say, last year was -15, which was a bit colder than what I would normally expect in this area. Normally probably about -10, something like that. So if we have -15, I'll probably lose the stems of most of these plants, but the roots will probably be okay for most of them. I might lose one or two, but generally I think with this amount of mulch on the ground, unless it's below freezing day after day for a week or two, the ground can only freeze so quickly. Even at -15, it's maybe only going to freeze 1 or 2 centimeters a day, and with about a foot of insulation there with all the mulch, it will probably take about a week or two for the ground to fully freeze down to the root level. And that's one of the things, if we have -15 or even -20 for one night, it's probably less damaging than -2 or 3 consistently for 2 or 3 weeks, as it's the consistent cold that gets the frost down deep into the ground. If it's just a hard freeze, it might kill the top growth of plants, but the ground doesn't tend to freeze quite as deeply. So if it's a mild winter, that could also be an issue. If it starts getting warm weather and the plants start to grow, they'll start producing extra humidity through their leaves, and they won't be able to grow because they'll be completely covered pretty much in darkness. They'll start using all the energy reserves to put out new leaves. That will weaken them, and that could also kill them. So hopefully we don't get it too mild. I'm hoping around 5 degrees, 8 degrees most days, and maybe frosty most nights, but nothing like 10 or 12 degrees during the day, and certainly not warm temperatures at night. So hopefully nothing starts to grow until later in spring, when it's time for me to unwrap them. And what I can do with these is I can easily take the top off, so I'll keep the sides on to keep the roots protected, and I can let any leaves grow out the top. And then if there is a particularly cold night, I can just wrap up the top with horticultural fleece to protect any of the leaves, and then later in the year I'll just slide the whole thing off and the plants will be free again, and I'll just kind of spread this mulch throughout the whole bed, because this mulch will slowly rot down over winter, so I'll need to keep topping it up anyway. So all this mulch just gets spread evenly throughout the bed. With the gingers, I did something similar to the Musa basjoo, but just not as deep. So I put lots of these stems, woody stems that say are hollow with pith inside. They're from the Jerusalem artichokes, so you can see them buried down there. That should provide a bit of extra insulation, and then I've just kind of covered that in mulch to keep that mulch. So I'm expecting the top growth of these to die off within the next few days when we get that -3, but the roots should be absolutely fine. And I'd like to keep the stems above the ground, even the dead ones, just so I know where they are, so that in spring when they start to grow again, I know not to dig in that area or plant anything new in that area. It's also I can keep an eye out for when they're starting to grow back and know where they are. So I think that's about it for this video. I'll probably see you guys in spring, and I'll show you the results, if they've survived the winter or not. As I say, it's the first time I've overwintered tropicals like this here in North Scotland, but I think I have to go the extra mile with how cold it can get here, so that's why I've gone for this PIR insulation, which is pretty much the highest thermal value you can really get with insulation like this. And hopefully with most of the gaps sealed, heavy mulch as well, I think most of my plants will survive the winter no problem. So I thought I'd add a little bit extra to the end of this video, just to show you the difference 5 days can make. But basically, after 2 days, most of the damage was done. So basically, there was a bad storm the day after I protected all the plants. It was only 5 days ago, and there's still 30,000 people without power. Basically, there was the worst storm in about 10 or 20 years, and I think there was over 100,000 people without power at one point. We were very lucky. Our electricity didn't go off, but driving around the day after, when most of the roads were closed and there was thousands of trees have been knocked down, so we were quite lucky. The damage wasn't too great here, but I'll show you what has been damaged. So plant wise, there's a combination of frost and wind damage. So the wind damage, as I say, was about, I think here was about 70 mile an hour gusts. Some places get close to 100 miles an hour. and it toppled a lot of trees. It toppled most of these plants. You can see the line on the side. And then the day after the wind came snow and frost. We only had a light covering of snow, and that's melted now, but we've had frost most evenings since, and the coldest it got was about -2. So you can see here, for example, the ricinus plants, they're all shriveled up and frost damaged. You can see that mottling, which is characteristic of the frost damage. The -2 wasn't enough to completely kill it off. The other plants like the nasturtium down there, that's pretty much been completely killed, as has the top half of my oxalis here, but that's to be expected. The roots are hardy though. Over here, the Zantedeschia is fine, but the gingers have got slight frost damage. You can see where this was protected by another plant, it's okay, but then again, you got the characteristic mottling effect there of the frost damage, so I'm expecting these gingers to die back. That one over there is also frost damaged, but just slightly less. And the canna lilies are completely destroyed. You can see they're ripped to shreds by the wind, but also from the frost. Now the actual insulation has held up well. I did put a lot of weight on the top with these bricks and the slabs, so they've held up nicely. To give you an indication of how strong the wind is, even the grass here, which is native and doesn't normally get damaged by storms too easily, you can see it's all lying in that one direction, and a lot of the leaves were blackened because the wind was so strong it just kind of dried them up to a crisp, so that's been destroyed. The souffly plant here as well has been snapped off, and the ones that weren't snapped off, the frost and the wind has completely crisped up all the leaves. They weren't looking too bad until the storm arrived. But the biggest damage I've had really is my greenhouse here. You can see I've lost several panes of glass. I'll put a picture up of my parents' one as well. They've also lost quite a bit of glass. The wind was particularly bad. It was surprising they lost any panes of glass because they actually have netting over the top, and they've also put in some extra silicone and sealant to hold the glass down, but they're in a coastal location, so they got it much worse. So I need to do a bit of tidy up here. You can see I've got broken glass all over the place. So it's a bit of a shame. I was hoping to fix this winter, but I might have to wait a bit longer because that's going to be a lot more glass than I was expecting to have to buy for preparing it. And then the rest of the bed, as you can see, a lot of wind damage, everything's swept to the side, but luckily I have wrapped everything up, so the things that are wrapped should be nicely protected now. And I was just in time, because if I had left this, the bananas would have been ripped to shreds and the frost would have probably damaged them as well. Now the Musa basjoo, the very top of the stem's poking out. There's minor frost damage on the side, but it's generally okay. I don't mind if I lose the top half of that stem, because it will just regrow from lower down from the part of the stem that has survived. So that's all for this video. Everything's wrapped up for winter. Hopefully we don't get too much more damage, but we'll see how much survives through to spring, and hopefully we'll get some nice plants growing again in springtime.